Kimmy K3.
Kimmy K3.
Kimmy K3.
Kimmy K3.
Kimmy K3. Kimmy K3.
Over the past week, Kimmy K3, a Chinese AI model few people outside China had heard of, started showing up everywhere, on model leaderboards, in developer forums, and across financial news. Kimmy K3 has 2.8 trillion parameters, making it the largest open-weight model ever released. And on several benchmarks, its performance comes surprisingly close to OpenAI's top models. So many people tried to sign up that Moonshot temporarily stopped taking new subscriptions. And then this stopped being just an AI story. Washington started talking about restrictions on advanced Chinese open-weight models, citing security and intellectual property concerns. But some of the biggest names in American tech wanted the exact opposite. On July 24th, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Meta, and 22 other organizations signed a letter warning policymakers not to close off open-weight AI too early. Jensen Huang shared it in his first ever post on X. The letter never mentioned Kimmy or China, but the timing was hard to miss. K3 had gone from an obscure model to part of America's argument over who gets to build, control, and profit from advanced AI. Kimmy looked like it had come out of nowhere. 18 months earlier, Moonshot was losing users, its original advantage was fading, and its new model had been buried by DeepSeek. Now developers and investors are paying attention again. The real story is how Moonshot lost its first lead, why paid growth eventually stopped working, and what it changed to come back. Before Kimmy was a chatbot, it was the English name used by Moonshot's founder, Yang Zhilin. Yang studied computer science at Tsinghua University and later earned his doctorate at Carnegie Mellon. Years before the current chatbot boom, he was working on a basic limitation of language models. They could only keep a limited amount of text in view. Give an early transformer a long document, and the beginning would eventually disappear from its working context. It was like reading a mystery novel while losing the opening chapters as you moved forward. In 2019, Yang co-authored Transformer XL, which allowed models to reuse information from earlier sections of text. He later worked on XLNet, another influential language model architecture. The research did not produce a consumer product, but it established the technical problem that would later distinguish Kimmy. Yang's first startup, Recurrent AI, sold software to businesses. By early 2023, it was becoming clear that foundation models could support mass-market products, and Yang and his co-founders created a new company. Its Chinese name is Yuejianman, the dark side of the moon, after the Pink Floyd album. In English, the company calls itself Moonshot, a less poetic choice, but one that makes the ambition pretty clear. Its assistant was named Kimmy. China's consumer AI market was still wide open. Several domestic companies had launched assistants, but none had become the chatbot most people automatically reached for. Moonshot did not need to pull users away from one entrenched leader. It needed to give them a clear reason to try Kimmy before another local app. Moonshot returned to Yang's old specialty. When Kimmy Chat launched in October 2023, it could process roughly 200,000 Chinese characters in a conversation. 5 months later, Moonshot announced support for 2 million. The practical use was easy to demonstrate. A user could upload an annual report, a legal case, a book, or a folder full of research and ask questions across all of it. Work that previously required cutting documents into smaller pieces could happen in one conversation. This mattered in a market where many early AI products still felt interchangeable. One assistant might write a slightly better email, and another might produce a slightly better summary. But those differences were difficult for ordinary users to judge. Kimmy's advantage was visible. A document that did not fit elsewhere could fit here. The feature also matched the kind of work that Moonshot wanted to attract. Financial analysts could compare long filings. Researchers could trace an argument across several papers, and office workers could search through material that would otherwise take hours to organize. Kimmy was not trying to beat every Chinese AI app at every task. It was giving a particular group of users a clear reason to open Kimmy first. Traffic surged. Kimmy climbed China's app rankings, and at one point, the service struggled to stay online. Investors saw a young founder with credible research, a clear technical specialty, and a product that seemed ahead of larger competitors. In early 2024, Moonshot raised roughly $1 billion at a reported valuation of about $2.5 billion. Its long context advantage had made the company valuable very quickly. The problem was that competitors could see the same opportunity. Kimmy's long context feature kept working, but it stopped being unusual. Other Chinese AI apps expanded their own context windows. File search improved, and retrieval systems became better at locating the useful parts of a document. Moonshot now had a good product without a durable reason to win. It tried to convert its early lead into scale before the market became more crowded. At first, that strategy worked unusually well. Moonshot was not asking people to abandon a chatbot they already used every day. In many cases, it was helping them form the habit in the first place. The company bought ads across Chinese mobile platforms and paid for App Store and device distribution. The advertising data company AppGrowing estimates that Kimmy spent roughly 900 million yuan on online advertising between March 2024 and March 2025. Kimmy reportedly passed 36 million monthly users in late 2024. It had captured a huge group of early users. The real test was how many of them would stay once the promotion slowed. Consumer AI products had almost no switching cost. People did not have a social network, years of photos, or a library of purchases holding them inside one assistant. If another model was faster, cheaper, or more interesting, moving took seconds. But the open field was turning into a paid distribution war. Keeping that audience meant continuing to spend against ByteDance and Tencent, companies with much larger consumer platforms and far deeper pockets. As competition intensified, keeping growth alive required more and more spending. This weakness became much harder to ignore on January 20th, 2025. Kimmy K3 could reason through mathematical problems, write code, and work across text and images. Its paper gave Moonshot a respectable technical release, but DeepSeek R1 had arrived less than 2 hours earlier. R1 climbed App Store rankings, moved technology stocks, and got the attention of governments and investors. It also made people ask a bigger question. How much could Chinese AI labs build without unrestricted access to the latest chips? Kimmy's release was lost in the coverage. More damagingly, DeepSeek had created enormous organic demand with a model breakthrough. Moonshot's growth, by contrast, still required expensive distribution. The contrast changed how investors viewed Kimmy's user numbers. Some began questioning retention, user quality, and whether the product had a real moat. Then the numbers started moving the wrong way. Quest mobile data, cited by Chinese media, put monthly active users at about 14 million in the second quarter of 2025 and under 10 million in the third. Moonshot was also dealing with an unrelated legal dispute. 5 investors in Yang's previous company, Recurrent AI, brought an arbitration case in Hong Kong involving his departure and the creation of Moonshot. The ownership fight gets complicated quickly. What matters here is the timing. It added governance and financing pressure just as Moonshot was losing users and technical attention. By early 2025, the company had several problems at once. Long context no longer set Kimmy apart. Paid acquisition was expensive and had not created enough loyalty. DeepSeek had taken the technical spotlight, while investor skepticism and the Recurrent AI dispute made the financing environment less comfortable. In February, Moonshot began cutting promotional spending across Android distribution channels and other advertising platforms. Reports at the time said the company was shifting its attention toward retention. The logic was simple. Buying more users would not fix the product. Moonshot moved resources back toward foundation model research and placed greater emphasis on coding, tool use, and agentic work. These jobs ask a model to carry out a sequence of actions, not simply produce one polished answer. This was a very different kind of competition. In a consumer chatbot, distribution can hide small differences in model quality because most users ask simple questions. Coding and agentic work are less forgiving. A model that forgets an instruction, calls the wrong tool, or introduces an error into a codebase becomes expensive very quickly. For Moonshot, this was a risk, but it was also an opportunity. The company could not match the largest internet platforms in advertising reach. It had a better chance of competing in a market where developers would actively test several models and move toward the one that completed the job. The company also began releasing open-weight models. Moonshot did not own a global consumer platform, so it could not place Kimmy in front of billions of people by default. Open weights offered a different form of distribution. Developers could download the model, adapt it, and use it inside products Moonshot did not control. The open weight strategy was practical, rather than purely ideological. Every outside deployment could introduce Kimmy to users who might never visit Moonshot's website. It also allowed companies to run the model in their own environments, change it for specific tasks, and avoid relying on a single hosted service. There was also a more basic problem. Moonshot had to get more out of limited computing power. It tested a training method called Muon on a smaller model named Moonlight. Muon appeared more compute efficient, although a method that works in a small experiment can still fall apart in a much larger training run. Moonshot developed a modified version called Clip. In the Kimmy K3 paper, the company said the model processed 15.5 trillion training tokens without a single loss spike, a form of instability that can make a large run extremely costly. Moonshot still needed enormous amounts of chips and capital. Clip was an attempt to get more useful training from the compute it had and keep a very large run stable. Kimmy K3, released in July 2025, became the first major test of that approach. K2 was a 1 trillion parameter mixture of experts model, with 32 billion parameters active for each token. That design gave the model a large pool of specialized capacity without using every part of the system for every answer. Moonshot released the model weights and emphasized coding and agentic tasks. Developers could now download Kimmy and test it without first becoming users of Moonshot's consumer app. The response was noticeably different from the silence around K1.5. Researchers examined the training method. Developers compared K2 with leading closed models, and Nature described the release as another DeepSeek moment. That description was generous, but people were paying attention to Moonshot again. K2.5 later added native visual understanding. Then, in early 2026, OpenClaw became popular. OpenClaw connected models to tools and allowed users to assign longer, practical jobs. This put different pressure on a model. A good first answer was no longer enough. It had to remember the objective and continue working through multiple steps. As OpenClaw usage grew, Kimmy K3 became one of the most used choices in OpenClaw-related rankings on OpenRouter. OpenRouter is not the whole AI market. Its audience leans heavily toward developers, but that made the signal more useful, not less. These people were choosing Kimmy to do real work, not clicking once out of curiosity. This was a different kind of growth from the consumer campaign of 2024. Moonshot was no longer paying to place an app icon in front of someone. The model was being selected inside a workflow because its price, speed, and task performance made it competitive. The scale was smaller than a mass-market app, but the behavior was more informative. Then came a much more concrete endorsement, Cursor. In March 2026, the company acknowledged that Composer 2, a model inside its coding product, had been built on Kimmy K3. Cursor had not clearly disclosed that foundation at launch, which drew criticism. Moonshot later said the model was being used through an authorized commercial partnership involving Fireworks AI. The disclosure issue mattered, but so did the product decision underneath it. A prominent Silicon Valley coding company had selected Kimmy as the basis for one of its own models. That decision also showed how an open model can travel without building a consumer brand first. Someone could be using Kimmy through another company's product and never see Moonshot's name. For Moonshot, being useful underneath the product could matter more than owning the product itself. The change was also visible in financing. Before K3 launched, Moonshot completed a round that valued the company at $31.5 billion. Moonshot may not be finished raising money. People familiar with the market say it could soon test a valuation of around $50 billion. That round has not happened, so $50 billion is still a target rather than a completed deal. It is being discussed as pre-IPO financing, potentially the company's last major private raise before seeking a listing in Hong Kong. Only a year earlier, investors had questioned whether paid growth was hiding a weak product. By mid-2026, Moonshot was being discussed as a possible $50 billion public market candidate. This recovery was already underway before K3. K2.5. OpenClaw and product adoption had restored technical credibility, and capital followed. K3 raised the level of attention, but it was not the beginning of the comeback. Moonshot released Kimmy K3 on July 16, 2026. The headline number was 2.8 trillion parameters. Moonshot says those parameters are spread across 896 experts, with only 16 active at a time. K3 works natively with text and images and supports a context window of up to 1 million tokens. That giant 2.8 trillion number needs some context. K3 does not use all of those parameters for every token it produces. Its mixture of experts design sends each token through a small part of the model, so it can hold an enormous amount of capacity without paying the full computational cost on every step. The company also introduced Kimmy Delta Attention and Attention Residuals, architectural changes intended to make a model of this size more efficient to train and use. Moonshot says K3 achieved roughly 2.5 times K2's overall scaling efficiency. None of this makes K3 cheap. It is still an industrial-scale system that needs substantial computing power, electricity, capital, and engineering. What it shows is that architecture and training methods can change how much a lab gets from that infrastructure. The first results were hard to ignore. K3 reached the top of a front-end coding ranking in several categories. Developers shared comparisons with Claude and GPT, and consumer demand pushed Moonshot close enough to capacity that it temporarily stopped taking new subscriptions. But launch week is when every model looks its best. Leaderboards measure particular tasks under particular conditions, and viral demos tell us very little about reliability across thousands of ordinary jobs. The first independent checks are less dramatic. A preliminary cyber evaluation by the United Kingdom's AI Security Institute and the United States Center for AI Standards and Innovation found K3 ahead of China's GLM 5.2 on the selected tests, but significantly behind the strongest frontier models in advanced cyber capability. That is one narrow test. It does not cancel out K3's coding results, and it does not tell us where the model ranks overall against Claude, GPT, or Gemini. But there is one complication that benchmark charts do not show: where the training data came from. US officials have accused Moonshot of secretly distilling Anthropic's models at industrial scale. Distillation itself is common. The accusation is that Moonshot used fraudulent accounts and evasive access methods to collect the outputs, breaking Anthropic's terms. A Moonshot employee has disputed the timeline, and the public evidence still does not prove that K3 was built from Fable. The July 24th industry letter made the same distinction. Legitimate distillation is one thing. Unlawful extraction is another. For any company thinking about using K3, the uncertainty matters. A model that looks attractive today could still run into sanctions or procurement restrictions later. So what can we actually say right now? K3 is unusually large, its early coding results are strong in some areas, and Moonshot's capacity problems point to substantial demand. Full weights, deeper independent tests, and evidence from everyday use will tell us how close it really is to the strongest frontier systems. US semiconductor shares fell around K3's launch, but K3 was not the only reason. Chip stocks were already under pressure from high valuations, export controls, and doubts about whether hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure spending would earn an adequate return. K3 landed in the middle of that anxiety. The valuations of leading AI companies and their suppliers rest on a few big assumptions. Frontier intelligence will remain scarce, technical leads will last, and a small group of providers will retain strong pricing power. Moonshot has not shown that advanced AI can be built without large amounts of capital. It has raised billions of dollars, and K3 itself is expensive to train and serve. So the real pressure is on the value of a lead. How long does it last, and how much is it worth? Kimmy's first advantage in long context did not remain exclusive. DeepSeek showed that a model breakthrough could redirect global demand almost overnight. Moonshot then recovered through a different mix of training efficiency, open weight distribution, and agentic products. If more challengers keep closing the gap, model prices could come under pressure and technical leads could become shorter-lived. That would not make AI infrastructure unnecessary, but it would change the returns investors should expect from parts of it, and the impact would not be the same for everyone. Lower model prices could mean more usage and more demand for computing infrastructure. At the same time, they could squeeze model provider margins and make a temporary lead harder to pay for. A data center operator, a chip maker, and a closed model company would feel that change very differently. That is why the July 24th letter matters. Open models can squeeze model provider margins while expanding the market for chips, cloud services, and enterprise software. Kimmy now sits right in the middle of that trade-off, and that is the bigger Kimmy story. It is not just a scoreboard against Claude or GPT. Investors are trying to work out how long any advantage can last, how quickly competitors can reproduce it, and whether customers will keep paying a premium once credible alternatives appear. K3 still has plenty to prove. What matters now is that Moonshot has become credible again after its first strategy failed. The comeback only looked sudden. Most of the rebuilding happened outside the English language AI spotlight. For investors, the harder question is how long spending the most can still buy a moat.